Welcome, everybody. I'm Christine Buckley, Executive Director here at the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, and happy to be joining you again with one of our monthly webinars. And this month is something different, something that's been really greatly needed. The topic is dealing with grief. And I'm thrilled to have some new folks that are helping us out with this subject now and going forward. From the Maria Droste Counseling Center, I have Michael Shanahan, licensed therapist, and Anna Aeschlimann, who's a mental health counselor, and they have a great deal of expertise and have been kind enough to share this time with us to, deal with some general questions. We'll do a little Q&A. Some of you submitted some great questions we'll address at the end, and others can put some questions in the chat, and as time allows, we will go through those. So again, Anna and Michael, thank you so much. Really appreciate having you with us. And also, I'm going to let you guys field the questions as you like. Whoever's going to answer, or you can both add to each question. We'll just see how that plays out. So the first question is, can you please define for the group what grief is?
Yeah, sometimes these are the hardest questions. But I did look it up just to see what the dictionary says, and I think it was on Wikipedia. Makes sense. It says grief is the response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or some living thing that has died, to which a bond or affection was formed. And then another site said that grief is a strong, sometimes overwhelming emotion for people, regardless of whether the sadness stems from the loss of a loved one or from a terminal diagnosis they or someone they love have received. And so some of the effects can be that people feel numb and removed from life, unable to carry on with regular duties, and just saddled with loss. And most of us talk about grief and loss in terms of that it comes in waves. It ebbs and flows, and it's there all the time, varying degrees.
I did the same thing too. I did look it up, just as an FYI.
Yeah.
Anna, anything to add to that?
Well, I think that's a very precise definition. Perhaps something to add is often, along with grief, there's the aspect of mourning, which is the expression of the grief. And so I think those two kind of go together. And oftentimes I think the mourning is something perhaps in our culture that we tend to not make enough space for. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Are there stages of grief? And if so, what are those stages? And does the grieving process ever end?
Yeah. So I think if you do like a deep dive into this, often there's the 5 process model that a lot of people talk about. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But that model was actually developed initially for death and dying by a Swiss-American psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And what research actually shows is that the model is less applicable to grief. So, we don't necessarily go through all these stages. We don't go through them in succession. We don't, sometimes we get stuck somewhere, and some people think like, oh, maybe I'm not grieving in the right way. So a more useful model seems to be, it's called the dual process model. And it basically says that there's 2 types of orientation towards grief and loss. One is a restoration orientation, which is individuals who are perhaps more task-centric. They kind of, after a loss or while they're grieving, they kind of want to get back to their life. They tend to be more future-oriented. And then the loss orientation is individuals who perhaps want to talk more about the loss, who express themselves more physically or emotionally. And it's not that one of these orientations is better than the other. They're just very different. And what the research shows is the most resilient individuals can actually oscillate between these 2 different orientations, and that builds resiliency. And I think it's important here too to note that often it's very gendered. the way grief is expressed, but that's culturally shaped. So, we have sort of an expectation in our culture that women will perhaps gravitate more towards a loss orientation, being more expressive. And in certain cultures, even women are designated to sort of cry and mourn. And we assume that men are going to be more towards the restoration orientation. And that can create a lot of problems for folks because, a woman who perhaps tends more in the other direction is often perhaps labeled as cold or, heartless, or a man who goes more in the direction of loss orientation can be seen as weak. And so I just, I think that's important to kind of point out here and just say that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. It's just a human response. And in terms of the grieving process ending, I think just to kind of piggyback off of what Mike was saying, I don't think it really does. I think it goes in waves, and depending on circumstances in our lives, grief can kind of resurface even after many years, and that's perfectly natural and normal. But I think over time, perhaps the waves become a little bit less strong than in the beginning.
Yeah, well said, Anna. And I would just add that I don't believe that the grief process ever leaves us. So we're always in grief in a sense, but I don't see that as bad necessarily, because I feel that we carry those we love with us all the time, and it actually becomes a strength. So we learn how to live without the physical presence of the person, and yet their energetic presence remains with us, and the love that we shared never dies. So the love you have for someone is just as visceral and vivid today as it was when they were with us, and that's why we have the initial grief, because it's the loss of the physical person, and it's sort of a identity reformation. Like, how do I go on without this person now in my life, especially if it was sudden? And it takes a while to do that. We have to get through those initial firsts of the first year, and then but then as we go on years later, we realize they're still with us in a way, but we still grieve them. I lost my father. I was blessed to have parents that lived a long time. My dad died at 80, but that was back in 2005. And I still think of him. It's not like that relationship's gone cold or old. It's like I talk to him just about every day, and my siblings do too. And so there's that's part of the hopeful part of grief, that it's not just the overwhelming, oh my God, this sudden shock, and and getting through that first year, and it's waves and it's sadness. There's also the longer term of grief where it's, we're 10 years out, now we're 20 years out, and I still carry this person. But this is why I think we talk about people as you get older, that you walk around the planet with wisdom. And the wisdom is, I'm carrying a lot of people I've lost, and I know they're with me somehow. And so you have this connection to the other side of the veil, as it were, so there's a power in that, and that's why it's hard to talk about. So I know a long answer to that, but that's a provocative question. Like, does it last forever? It's like, yeah, it kind of does, but it's not all bad. That is, I think, some hopeful news.
I was just going to say that was not too long of an answer, and I think the more information and that you can provide to people going through this, I think the better. So thank you for that. And the next question is: the grieving process more difficult at certain times of the year?
Yeah, I think it is, as I just referenced, person in like, our first Thanksgiving without the person, or it's our wedding anniversary, or it's his birthday, her birthday. All those firsts are tough. And times of the year, like now, many of us are sensitive to the light. We had the change of clock, set your clocks back, fall back. It's like, I go in shock, like, I have a 3 o'clock client just ended. It's 4 o'clock here on the East Coast. You know,
Oh, you just hit mute, Mike. You just hit mute.
it's because I'm talking with my hands. It shouldn't be done.
Yeah.
Oh, at least I didn't disconnect myself. But you know, so the darkness affects us. You know, the holidays are stacked in the darkness. You know, you got Halloween, you got a month later, here we are, Thanksgiving next week, and then Christmas and New Year's and Hanukkah, and you know, so there's lots of stuff coming up, and it absolutely can and does affect people, along with those other birthdays, anniversaries, family events. You know, absolutely.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I
Go ahead, Anna.
add to like certain places can also, you know, when we go to certain places, that can also increase the grief response, remind us of the person we lost in some way or another. And even very simple things like hearing a song on the radio, or that, you know, is that our song with that person, or a movie, or, you know, just these very small things in daily life can, you know, remind us and kind of produce that grief response.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Again, I know some of these questions are big and loaded, but what are ways that people can cope with their grief in this thing, seeing a therapist for everyone?
Yeah, so I guess those are two separate questions. So I'll try to address the first one, and Mike, please, you know, jump in as well. But so ways that people can cope with their grief. I think just to tie it in with what I was saying earlier with the restoration and the loss orientation, it can look very different for different people. And I remember in grad school, one of my professors, who was a grief counselor, actually told us about a couple, and this example always stayed with me, so I wanted to share it here. They had lost a child, and they had very different ways of grieving. The wife kind of wasn't unable to go back to work, and you know, was crying all the time and really wanted to talk about the child and the loss. And the husband went back to work very quickly. He would come home, he would just go down in the basement, work on his woodwork. He didn't want to talk about things. And one day the wife went downstairs and said, okay, I need to talk to you about this. Like, I feel like you're not grieving. And he showed her, he's like, I was carving an angel out of wood for our child. So he was grieving in his own way. And I think that's just important to remember that, you know, everyone has different ways. Something that I think for everyone is really important is self-care during these times, because, you know, finding things, activities, people that nourish you, that help you feel sustained, perhaps even rejuvenated, that's really important to kind of lean into. Social support. So if you have people that you find are, you know, understanding, compassionate, supportive, leaning into that. And then I think for some people, there's, you know, a faith or a spiritual dimension to coping. And then I think that aspect of mourning that I mentioned earlier is, you know, acknowledging a loss of control and powerlessness over a situation. And that's really scary often, but those feelings they're there. And I think the more we can make room for them, perhaps, you know, perhaps we can improve our coping mechanisms a bit. In terms of seeing a therapist, I don't think that seeing a therapist is for everyone. What I have heard from a number of people is that, you know, as time goes on, sometimes the response from family, friends, the workplace, other communities we're involved in around our grief can kind of reduce, you know, as people move on with their lives. Maybe after a certain amount of time, certain people can feel like pressure of like, oh, you know, they feel people want them to move on, quote unquote, or perhaps they even feel judged for still being very grief stricken after months or, you know, years. And I think in those cases, often it's very helpful to have, you know, a therapist or even just someone else to talk to, who can be there to receive your grief and continue to support you in your own grieving process, whatever that looks like.
I was just going to add that another resource that we have is one another. And so family members and friends, those that love you, they're there to help support you. And that's definitely a resource. And so it's time to reach out to friends. And, often people don't know what to say, but if you've gone through it, you don't have to say anything. It's just don't abandon people and be there for one another. So definitely reach out to family and friends and have a shoulder to cry on, but also to do the things Anna's talking about, and also make plans and do things to get out of the house. Being out in nature is such a good thing, and doing the things that you enjoy doing with the person. So but just having people around you, using the supports that you have. And then, the other point about the therapist, of course, as therapists, I would say, of course, go see a therapist. Anna's more honest than I am, but it doesn't hurt to try, because whenever anybody's come for therapy, I've had sessions with people that last one session. They come in with a question, and you answer the question. They're like, thanks, and they don't need to come back. So sometimes you don't know, and if you're unsure, I don't know if this would be helpful. I lost somebody. I'm in grief. I don't know if you can help me. Hey, let's just talk and see what evolves. And, the therapist, will hopefully be honest about, this is helpful. And I always tell people, if therapy is helpful after 2 sessions, whether it's a good fit with that therapist or if therapy is for you. So it's not a bad idea to try it, but like Anna's saying, I wouldn't want to overload you. Yes, you must see a therapy. There's no must in grief. There's only what's going to be helpful, and what are things that are not. So if now's not the right time, you might need a few weeks or months before you can even have the energy to make that call.
Excellent. Thank you both. So are grief support groups a source of comfort for people? And in general, are they made up of people of similar ages, and are people at different stages of grieving?
Yeah, I think groups, in my experience doing groups of all kinds over the years, is that they're always different, and it really depends on who's in the group for the dynamics, because it's people getting together. And I've had groups of 2 and 3 that were very powerful, and groups with 12 that were good and some not good. And so it's hard to legislate, because it's just kind of how the group gels together, and what are the things we're talking about. Because the content can be helpful. Anna and I could run a grief group and have lots of content that people would find helpful. But in terms of the sharing that a group can do, and if that feeds you, and if it's said in the right way, in a helpful way, that's all sort of up in the air. And so I've always told people, especially for AA groups, things like that, try a group, and if it works for you, great. But don't feel bad if it's I went to a couple of these group sessions, and I'm leaving not helped, or I'm agitated, then it's not the right fit. But it's not that the grief group was bad. Maybe you do another grief group down the street or next year or something, and suddenly that one is the perfect one for you. So that's what I would say to that.
Anna, anything to add?
No, I think Mike summed it up really nicely. And I do think that often, sometimes with groups, people who lead groups do screenings for a group. So they might indeed only select people who are experiencing a certain kind of loss, or who are at a similar age. And, other groups aren't like that. So it really is very dependent on who's running the group, and then also who shows up, so it doesn't necessarily mean that if people have, suffered different kinds of loss, that the group then is not going to be as helpful or meaningful. So, yeah.
Okay. And this question ties in a little bit, but what do you think is the greatest value of a grief support group? And does it help to have people who have suffered a loss from a similar cause?
Yeah, so I think if I had to name one greatest value, I would say that it's really connecting with others, kind of what Mike was saying earlier, because grief can feel very isolating often. And being with others who have experienced a similar loss can help us feel less alone. It can be a source of strength for us. We can receive empathy from others. We can give empathy. We can nourish each other. And so that would be the connection. I would say that's the biggest value. In terms of, does it help to have people who have suffered a loss from a similar cause? I think it's not mandatory, as I said earlier, but sometimes if you have a group with people who have experienced different kinds of loss, it can create some tension. So, for example, if one group member has experienced the loss of a person and another member has experienced the loss of a pet, the group member who has lost the person might feel that, their loss is more significant, and the person who's lost the pet might not necessarily agree with that. And so that can, sometimes be a little bit of an impediment. But I think then it's helpful to have the therapist there to kind of facilitate understanding and cohesion. Not to say that it can't work, but sometimes it's a little bit more difficult.
Mike, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and then I think another advantage of groups, where it can be helpful is just people that have gone through profound loss of any kind, often talk about how neighbors, friends, even family can shun them or, walk the other way across the street, and feel like a little bit isolated because people don't know what to say, and they feel the difference, the subtle differences in relationships, and that can be hard. And so a group can be a nice way for folks to talk about that, and everyone nodding their head like, yeah, that's my experience too, and I'm glad to hear someone else say it. So it gets into some of the nooks and crannies of like some of the stuff not talked about and that people are suffering privately, sometimes even within their own families. Especially if somebody dies who might have had mental health issues, or they were, a little bit caustic or verbally abusive, and there's mixed feelings about him, like, he died something so sad, and yet I have anger towards him, and I can't say that to anybody because it's like not politically correct, or, they're looking at me funny. But, again, people will nod and say, yeah, I had that same experience and I've never said this to anybody. So that's a value as well.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for that. Now we're going to go to questions that people submitted who registered here. Can you talk a little bit about the grief that a survivor has because they lost themselves, and then coupled with survivor guilt? Having lost who they were before, and then again the guilt of still being here when they know others didn't make it.
Yeah, that's a complicated one because it's different for everybody. Why did I survive? And a lot of some of the counseling I've done with vets, they have that where they were right in harm's way and somebody inches or feet from them was killed and they weren't. And so it's really has to be dealt with on an individual basis. But our life is a gift, and it can be taken in a moment. And if you survive, it's not the people that have left us. None of them are saying you should feel guilty. It's not coming from anybody that's passed. So there's only support for a person that has survived. And again, it's identity reformation. So we're all changed through any loss of a loved one. We're really wounded by that. It's a wounding of the heart. And so survivor guilt is part of that. But it's ultimately, from a mental health perspective, I would say, it's not something that's going to help you living with that. And so it does need to be removed, as it were. And therapy is a good way to have that help in that regard. It's a real thing, but it can be lessened by having, verbalizing that and then going back and forth with a therapist who can help move you through that. But it's often very individual, so it's hard to talk about it in a general way other than it's known, you're not bad for having it, but let's help you with it, because thank God you're alive. That's the bottom line, is all of our lives are a gift, and yours is too. So you should not feel guilty because you were the one that survived.
Excellent.
Yeah, and
Mike.
perhaps add to that too, that often what we do in therapy is, for instance, meaning making, and meaning making doesn't mean an explanation for what happened, but often it's really about embracing mystery, the mystery of it. We really don't know why, that one person survived and another person didn't. And it's sitting with that uncertainty and that mystery that's often part of the healing process. And also this, the first part of the question was, how do I kind of cope with the loss of who I was before? I'm not the same person anymore. And we talk about narrative therapy in the psychotherapy space, but really what that says is, we all kind of walk around with a story we have about ourselves and about our lives, the way we kind of see the future unfolding, or hopes and dreams we have for ourselves, for our loved ones. And a loss, if it's a loss of a certain capacity we might have had, that is always a disruption to our narrative. It's a narrative disruption. And so part of the healing is about creating a new story for ourselves. And, that happens together with a therapist often, but like redefining, a reorientation, a re-identification of who we are, what our life means, and how we're going to move forward with the time we have left.
Thank you. Next question. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with grief during holidays and then like that birth date and the death date?
I think one thing is perhaps, first of all, anticipating that these times are going to be more difficult, right? That first Thanksgiving without the person, or the anniversary, the birthday. So sometimes just mentally preparing for it can take a little bit of the stress off. And I think also sometimes what people find useful is having some kind of ritual to engage in around those times. Just having it can be something very small. Like I have I buy a certain candle and I light it and I just sit in front of the candle and I remember the person. Or, I watch this certain movie we used to watch together, or, I go to a restaurant we used to go to, something that, because often ritual is a way of coping and of grieving. So that can be useful during those times.
Great.
I always advise to, like to offer family members, hey, we're coming up on the anniversary of when so-and-so died. Here's some options. I was thinking we could go to the gravesite, or we could do, like Anna's saying, the things that he or she loved to do. But it's okay if you don't want to participate in that, so to offer things, to talk about it, to have it on the table so that everyone knows, hey, we're remembering this person, they're still with us. And again, what Anna said earlier, people have different ways of expressing grief. Somebody wants to make a wooden angel, so offering things to do, but not making it hard and fast. Like, we're all going to the gravesite and, you better come, but it's like, yeah, if you want to join us, I'm going to go. I'd love to have you join me. And 3 of the 5 people come. Great. So just to keep it loose, and because that's a respectful way. This year, somebody might not want to. They're in a different place. I want to take a walk by myself. Go, that absolutely, that kind of thing.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question, I think that is a tough one. As a parent that has lost a child, what suggestions do you have for parents that deal with the loss very differently?
Parents that deal with the loss differently, like each parent is dealing with it differently?
Yeah, so they lost their child and they have 2 different ways of grieving, which then causes some
That's right. I know it can be, sometimes in marital dynamics and family dynamics, it can be, there's other issues that are fueling the discord. Like, I never feel like you regard my feelings well, and now I'm grieving the loss of our son or daughter this way, and I don't feel you're there, and so I'm attaching some of that negative feeling to how you're doing it. As well as, again, it's a reason why therapy could be helpful to help untangle some of those feelings, because again, there's different ways people express it and grieve it, and sometimes, if I'm the more emotional one of the couple, and couples are often, the Jungian philosophy is we marry our opposites. We're attracted to the opposite. I'm an introvert, so I marry an extrovert kind of thing. If in my case, my wife is the one who cries, I might let her do the crying, and then I can help her, like, oh, I'm tending to her because she's, grieving the loss of our son, but I might do it my own private way, but she might not know that, so there, it's not always a bad thing either. It could just be a way of, like, I don't know who I am in this process of losing something like a son or daughter. And so I don't know anything. I can't even begin to go cross over and look at your grief and assess if it's good or not. So I'm just confused. And guess what? It's easier to say, you're not grieving as well as I am, or you're doing it wrong. So I hope I'm clear in that. It can be convoluted, but it's, again, I think if you're having struggles as a couple dealing with the loss, it might be good to come to a family therapist to help untangle that a little bit, because there's often, different things happening there.
Okay. Anna, anything to add to that?
No, I was really thinking along the same lines as Mike, is just when there's a couple, or even, within a family like mother-daughter, or, there's so many layers to every relationship that often the ways we kind of feel perhaps unsupported in our grief by the other person, there's usually other things on top of that too. So sometimes working with someone to kind of untangle some of those layers can be really useful. And I think just also remembering, just bringing to mind that there are many different ways to grieve, and that everyone grieves in their own way. And, I think sometimes I've seen that assumption kind of baked in of like, oh, you're not supporting my grieving process, or you're not grieving enough, or in the way I think you should be, quote unquote. So just, perhaps challenging some of those assumptions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Another one that's hard, I think most of these are, how does someone deal with their grief of losing who somebody once was? So for instance, if someone has a bad brain aneurysm rupture, and we see it all the time, and I know family members feel like, their mother now is no longer that person they once knew. So the person is still with them physically, but they are very different. So they're grieving the loss of who they were before.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think an important thing is making room for that, because it's true. Their essence is the same, right? From a more spiritual perspective, right? That's unchanged. And, but our ways of interacting with the person can be very different, or their ways of understanding and perceiving. And that is often, it's a loss. And so making room for that, and not pushing that away, or thinking, oh, I'm not allowed to feel that, I should just accept the situation as it is. I think that's an important first step. And then, with time, I think we can still have a relationship that's meaningful and beautiful in a different way. And also being open to that, like, yeah, the connection I had before isn't quite the same, but it can iterate, it can move, and it can still be precious. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well said. And I would also add to that, to let the conflicting feelings be there, because there could be anger often, like, why did this happen? Or, I'm angry, you're not the same person. Or I'm just angry, I can't relate to you the way I could before, and whether it's dementia or a serious accident or anything that's caused a marked change in somebody. And that's often goes hand in hand with grief and the loss. But there is, trying to navigate those. But I would say to let the conflicting feelings be on the table. You might have 15 different feelings or 5 different feelings, and they're all okay to be there.
Thank you. Another question, do you know of any workbooks or apps or anything that you could recommend that just people could, learn to follow something maybe each day, to journal or something like that you would recommend?
Well, journaling for one on its own is helpful for many people, whether you've tried it or not, just to see if you like it. But often to get your feelings out on paper can be a very helpful thing. And for others, I've found, even with their phone to use, to record things that they can listen back to things they said if they're upset, or just offer reflections verbally to themselves. And apps, yeah, the new ones come out all the time. I don't have one off the top of my head, but I would definitely, you can look one up on grief and see if you like it. It's, again, some of that's a personal choice for what's going to be helpful to you. And I know Anna has done more recent studies on grief. I don't know if you have a book, Anna, from your, if you have something to offer.
I read a book. I thought it's by a theologian, a Catholic theologian, but I think it's not, Catholic per se. He talks about he lost a son, and it's called Lament for a Son. It's a very short little book. You can read it in a couple hours. And I was very moved by it because he really kind of goes deep into his feelings of just being with the grief and the loss. So that could be a place to start. There was also, and I cannot remember the name, a podcast that one of my teachers recommended to me. I'll look it up while perhaps Mike is answering the next question. And he did a whole, a little podcast series on grief, and it was really excellent. I listened to a couple of them. So I'll look that up and perhaps put it in the chat for everyone. Yeah.
And Anna, can you just say the name of that book one more time?
It's called Lament. I'll put it in the chat. Lament for a Son by Nicholas Wolterstorff. And I'll look it up. His last name is spelled a bit.
Good luck. Good luck spelling Wolterstorff.
Yeah, I'll have to look. So I'll mute myself quickly and look those 2 things up and pop them in the chat.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you, Anna.
You're welcome.
Lynn, did you see any other questions in the chat that were a little bit different?
You had answered one of them, and one says, what if the grieving individual doesn't trust people and therefore says therapy is of no use? How do you respond to that?
What if the person grieving says therapy is of no use?
No use, and they want to know how to respond.
Oh, somebody else wants to know how to respond to that person. Like,
yeah,
therapy is of no use. Yeah, you can't and shouldn't force anybody to go to therapy. It really is an individual choice. And sometimes we get people calling, an adult calling for their adult son or daughter saying, he really needs therapy. And we always have to tell them, well, get that person to call us because we can't, you can't force somebody into therapy. Often, if you've been in therapy, though, you could talk about your experience and why it was helpful to you, and that's often the best thing to do. But yeah, if the person grieving doesn't want help, there's little we can do. It's sort of like how we deal with addictions. I can tell this person has a substance abuse, they're alcohol dependent, but if you ask them, no, I'm not, and it's like everyone around them seeing that what's happening. So it can be very frustrating. There's not a lot of choices you have, but I always find it helpful to try to hold people in high regard, and if you're have faith, pray for them. If and if you live with them, try to be as kind and patient with them as you can, because that's kindness and treating one another well always helps a person. And sometimes it, they see how you're dealing with it and they say, I want some of that. Like you seem to be dealing with the same loss I have, but in a much better way. What's your secret?
Okay. And then there was just one more question. It says, my mom and I are dealing with my grandmother's death, her mother, very differently than I did. She was much more private about her grief. And then I didn't know if I should share my grief with her.
Yeah, in a case like that with relationships, again, I think it's always good to share your feelings and say, I'd be happy to talk with you about the loss of grandma, and I don't know if you like that or not, and but I have a need to maybe share about her, and I know we grieve in different ways, so if you'd find that helpful, I'm happy to do it. And, if now's not a good time, maybe later, or if you want to think about it, so you're giving options. You just don't want to make it like a have to kind of thing. But I think it'd be good to make an overture, to make an offer, an offer to the person. Sometimes you're surprised. I've had clients do that. Why don't you go talk and see what happens? Just ask it in this way, in a kind way, and it's like, oh my God, they were completely open. I never thought they would be. It's
true. I just wanted to make a comment. Well, what someone said, I think is kind of interesting. Saying, wow, everything everyone's saying hit so close to home. I've been through it all. And after 9.5 years, some things are the same, but now we just manage grief differently. So I'm assuming that's probably common and probably a good thing, right? Like you said, the grief is there, but as you go through time, you deal with it differently.
That's right. And the hidden gift of grief is you have the grief because you love this person. And, love is always a gift. And so part of the grief is I don't physically have them. And then all the associations, I'm from Chicago, and my mother lived in Chicago. My two brothers live in Chicago, and my mother spent a lot more time at my brother's house than she ever did. I live in Boston, so she's not out here. So when mom died, I don't have many associations out here in Boston with mom because she wasn't here. But my brother, mom was over every other weekend, and dad was over there helping fix the house. So he suffered much more because it's like all that stuff of I would have called mom to come over, that I don't have. So that's one aspect of it. But if you can widen out to the fact and see the fact that part of what is involved in grief is the love I have for a person. And again, I teach that love doesn't die. And so when we realize that I am carrying my father with me and my mother with me, and the relationship I had with them has not stopped in 2005 or in 2022 when both of them died. Like it's continuing, and there's a gift in that, and that sustains me, even though there's times when I have tears and I miss them. So it's not to deny the pain, like, oh, they're there, you shouldn't feel. No, the grief, the sudden loss is real. But the long arc of grief is that we're carrying these people with us, and it opens us up to others in life. And you know how it is when you talk to somebody that's lost somebody. They're right there with you. They're not walking on the other side of the street. They're coming up to you and giving you a hug and saying, I hear you, I see you, I am with you. And I've heard people say this and experienced it myself. And that, that knowing comes at a cost, but it's a gift. And there's nothing wrong with walking on the planet carrying that gift.
Yeah, that's very nicely said. And I think this someone else to question, but I don't think that there is such thing as like you can't compare the amount of suffering or grieving. It's just differently. I would assume is true.
Yeah. I think it's suffering is suffering, I think especially as a therapist, that's how we think about it. We sit with so many different kinds of suffering produced by different causes. And I think in our minds, we can always find someone who's either suffering less or suffering more in our perception. But we really never know how much someone is suffering. And so I think just suffering is suffering.
That's right. And that's why it's not, like Anna was talking about in the group, somebody lost a dog or a pet, and somebody else loses their spouse or something tragically. It's like apples and oranges. And, how can you tell a person who's in actual grief for their pet that, well, that's less than what I've got. It's like, yeah, you don't, you can't, you shouldn't. It's different things.
No, thank you. So I just probably going to wrap things up now, but I want to let everybody know here. Again, we've had some great conversations with Anna and Mike, and they're kicking this webinar off as the beginning to establishing a grief support group. So soon we'll let everybody know when that's going to begin and, what day and what time, probably a similar time slot. But we just feel that it's important. And then when we have that online support group, probably be targeted subjects and topics and have it be a little bit more interactive and conversational with whoever is on. But we feel it's definitely needed. We know in this community, brain aneurysms impact people in so many ways and so tragically that we just feel it's important for people, again, if you're a survivor grieving the loss of your prior self, or if you've lost actually physically somebody, or if you're taking care of somebody who is a different person now, we can focus on those different topics. But we're just very fortunate to have found some great people to work with on this, and we know how important it is. So I want to say thank you to Anna and Mike so much for your time and sharing. Thank you for everybody coming on. This has been recorded, and we're going to share it and send it out to everybody. And I just want to take the opportunity to wish everyone, a happy Thanksgiving, as though I know for many of you it is going to be hard. And we've all had different losses in our life. It is a tough time. But I think it'll be nice to know that we have one another, and, maybe haven't been to a grief support group before, and this webinar is just that beginning. So thank you for reaching out. Anna and Mike, any parting words? But again, a big thank you to you both.
Just thank you very much for having us, for having me, and for putting this on, Christine and Lynn, and to everyone who came here and sat with us and listened. It's really a gift to spend this time with you all, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thanks,
Thank
Anna.
you.
Well said. I echo exactly what Anna said. Thank you. This was I enjoyed being with you, and it's a great topic to be talking about. And if anything we say or do, it can be helpful. Amen.
All right. Thank you,
much.
everyone. Have a great evening. Take care.